Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hitting right at 1 o'clock here in Lincoln, so I'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining in. I'm Tyler Williams, Extension Educator in Climate and Agriculture from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and thanks for joining this month's webinar. It's put on by the North Central Climate Collaborative and the North Central Region Water Network. And this month we have Mike Wilson, Senior Scientist at NRCS, talking about the Adaptation Resources for Agriculture Publication Workbook. This workbook is designed to allow extension specialists, technical service providers, and others to guide through a 5-step process to better understand climate impacts on their production system. And I'll leave the rest of the details to Mike, but this is certainly a concept and idea that's been on the mind of a lot of producers and advisors with the ongoing weather challenges we've had this year. So before we begin, I want to mention that you can type in any questions into the chat box. You can do that as we go along, and I'll address them as we get to the end. Unless there's something pressing, then I'll interject and get the question answered. But I'll try to keep most of the questions towards the end. Also, here in a bit, when I get this started, I'll go ahead and bring up a couple poll questions. They're very, very easy and short, but I'll leave them up for a couple minutes until we get most of the responses. And there'll also be a poll question at the end as well, so you can look for that. And we do appreciate your willingness to answer those. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and get the show on the road, and I'll turn it over to Mike and let him take it away from here. So thanks again, Mike, for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, very glad to. So can you hear me?
Yes, yep, I can hear you.
Okay. Today I'd like to talk about a publication from the Climate Hubs that we did a few years ago, and basically looking to promote to a greater degree as time goes on, because we think we have a good resource or good tool here, and I want to make sure people are aware of that. First, I just thought I'd kind of mention the Climate Hubs in case somebody's not quite aware of them. There's 10 USDA Climate Hubs. We've been in the business for about, I guess 5 years now. And it's really a collaboration amongst the USDA agencies, but more than just that, we look to build a lot of work on creating partnerships with other agencies and non-government agencies, all sorts of folks that might be interested in working together for the betterment of agriculture. And so, the hub really can be defined in 3 emphasis areas, and you can see those there, doing assessments, outreach, as well as technical support. But one thing that the Hubs cite as one of their goals is really having a deliberate integration of climate change information in both short-term management and long-term planning for decision-making and actions within the control of the producers. So, the Adaptation Resources in Agriculture is a really good example of what we can accomplish, and we need to get that into the hands of a lot of people so they can maybe start working with producers and, see a better way or one particular pathway in order to achieve success. And so the publication was done in 2016. The first version covers the Midwest and the Northeast states. It was done by the Climate Hubs and personnel within USDA from those areas. And you can see down below that is the list of names. And I have to give a hand to both Maria with the Forest Service and Dan Dotsey with NRCS, really taking this publication over the top and, getting it accomplished, because a lot of things get started, but what we really need to do is have some success and finish things off. And they really did a good job and making it available for folks. So, the thing is, a lot of landowners and managers might not be sure how to apply climate change issues at their scales of their farms. And so this workbook was really created to help do that. I thought I'd throw this in, basically looking at the website of the North Central region. There was a workshop about a year ago, and the attendees of that workshop basically listed a lot of the issues and impacts that they see that are occurring in that particular region. So I'm not going over these, but obviously we're all pretty aware that climate change has caused impacts on various sectors of agriculture. Also, while we produce this adaptation resources in agriculture, I think it's great to take a step back and see how did it get created and what was the original origins of these kind of concepts. And I have to put a hand out for NIACS, or the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science in Houghton, Michigan. About, 7 or 8 years ago, they developed the Forest Adaptation Resources. And so it was a great opportunity then for them to start looking at the impacts of climate change on forest resources. And what they found out is there was a real demand for this product. And so they've got over 250 projects that have been using their Forest Adaptation Workbook. And you can see that by doing these projects, not only have they reached a lot of landowners and such, but they also have been able to cooperate with a lot of different partners. And I think that's what we're trying to do here: get out, reach out, work with people, and make sure that we're all working together, compiling some resources and seeing if we can really have an impact on agriculture and for the betterment of things. Now, the Adaptation Resources for Agriculture is composed of 5 different chapters, and we'll talk about those a little bit. But by and large, it is a structured, flexible process to assess climate change impacts and challenges, and then look at farm level adaptation tactics, and maybe evaluate certain actions that can be used in order to basically improve responses to extreme and uncertain conditions. What it does not do is it doesn't recommend specific management actions or policies. It's not a dictatorial thing that, as you work with a producer, you come up with 10 things that they need to do. It's basically working through with the producer, garnishing their ideas as well as your own about what are some of the things that could be done in order to improve the situation for these producers. And then they can take those suggestions and then see which ones are applicable, which ones work, which ones are really a no-brainer that just they might as well get going. And as we found, as we go through some of these demonstration projects, a lot of producers are already doing some of the things that they need to do. This workbook doesn't address non-climate related risks. It's very much narrow focus on just the climate and climate change. And it's not a adaptation actions that, it's a complete list of everything. Obviously, there's still a lot of flexibility. Every producer is going to have different ideas. Every situation is a little bit different. And basically it can expand into the future. And I think that brings up the point that climate change adaptation is just one part of a big picture. And that, producers have a lot of different motivations, expectations, things that really drive their actions. And this climate change adaptation is just one of those. But somebody needs to step up, and basically help them see how they can maybe look at making some changes on their agricultural systems in order to improve. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting to me is I always, when we started out, we call it adaptation resources. And it's like, well, it's a workbook. Well, no, it's more like a manual of several resources together. And the first one would be the adaptation strategies and approaches, which is like a menu that we put together on different aspects of agriculture and the tactics can be used. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Then one part is the workbook itself, the 5-step process. And then finally, the third part of the workbook is the adaptation action. So some real case studies that people can see how work has been going on and then what sort of ideas that followed. And so again, it's not about making recommendations for people to follow. It's just a process to help producers become more organized and see things in a logical sequence and develop their own customized adaptation plans. And really it is, it's complementing existing management planning and decision-making systems. So the workbook process itself is 5 particular steps. And if you know anything about adaptation, you see these 5 steps used for a whole lot of different sectors and ecosystems and such like that. But the first one of those is to define where you are and what do you care about. The second is, what's the particular place and how is it vulnerable to climate change? What sort of climate change issues are taking place at that particular location? Third step, the challenges and opportunities and that climate change might present. Then what actions, might actually benefit the producer. And we'll talk about each of these in a little more detail. But I see the real crux of this workbook is these strategies and approaches. And this is where a lot of time was spent trying to pull together that information. And then finally, the last step is just, monitoring and evaluating, the system or the recommendations that were put into place. The first step, define management goals and objectives. And to help us sort of see this, I've taken one example of a demonstration project of the R&G Miller Sons farm up in Wisconsin. This particular case study or demonstration project was done by Adam Dowling in his work with the last year. Adam is a district conservationist in Madison, Wisconsin. So he worked with the Miller & Sons farm, and you can see that that's about 1,500 acres of certified organic land split between pasture and then row crop to basically feed their dairy herd and younger stock, which is about 800 head. The goals and objectives they came up with were to produce high quality organic milk, increase grain and hay yields, maintain productivity of their cows. Then obviously, because it's a dairy, energy efficiency of the facilities is a real key as well. So they've defined the first step. The next one is, how do we assess the climate change impacts and vulnerabilities? Well, I put together this busy slide just to kind of show you some of the information that is available out there. One of sort of the gold standard for understanding climate impacts is the National Climate Assessment. The fourth one of these was published a year ago in 2018. There's chapters for each of the different segments. And so it's a really great resource. It's online to go ahead and to look at what vulnerability is occurring in your particular area. But there's other documents as well. The Climate Hubs have all produced assessments of climate change vulnerabilities for each of their regions. Down below that, you can see a number of states have actual climate change documents for their particular states. And so all of these are available and can be useful in terms of determining what the impacts are on a particular farmstead. In a general sense, this comes from the National Climate Assessment. This is just for the Midwest in general. You can see over the past 30 years, we've had increasing amounts of rainfall from April to June, which leads to both positive and negative issues. Some wetter conditions at the end of the growing seasons. The last spring frost is occurring earlier, so we're getting more frost-free days to work with. But also, in the Midwest at least, there's been a lesser amount of heat stress and longer growing season. And in some cases, that's favored some good productivity within the region. Now, within the Miller farm, these were the basically the vulnerabilities that they felt were very important. One was they had an increase in average temperatures, more days greater than 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And along with that, higher nighttime temps, longer frost-free season, again, more winter-spring precipitation, greater intensity, as well as with more rainfall, you get potential summer droughts as well. So all of these are climate impacts that might have some role to play on their particular farm. The third step would be to evaluate basically the management objectives from step one, given the particular vulnerabilities and the climate change issues that are occurring. So on the Miller farm, we have both challenges and opportunities, and you can see them listed here for crops. Obviously more difficult to get in the spring and do some field work, harder to plant. It is a dairy, so they have to haul manure. So that can be an issue at certain times of the year, as well as ponding and, again, the drought. But on the opportunistic side with climate change, there could be longer growing seasons if there's sufficient water. There seems to be more options from seed companies that are growing with that to help produce either different varieties of crops or different crops themselves. And so there's a lot of opportunities that occur. Within the pastures, the wet springs make some real issues, whether it's dealing with the cattle, diseases, or just plant productivity. But plant productivity could increase depending on the amount of moisture. And then in the farmstead, with the higher temperatures, obviously more cooling and ventilation is needed. There's manure handling and storage issues. So now as we go to step 4, and this is really the crux of the workbook as I see it. This is the part that was really took a long time to develop. It was kind of a learning curve for me because as Maria was coaching us along in terms of how we want to design these particular strategies and approaches, it's one of those things you have to start to understand what's going on and how they actually develop these things. But a strategy and approaches is basically a menu to help managers translate broad concepts into specific action items or tactics. And it also shows a rationale for why you're doing something. And so they're trying to go from really broad concepts down to individual actions. And then people can sort of see where they fit in and better understand why they're doing that. So within the workbook, there's 8 different strategies. Obviously, these strategies are really broad ideas. As it says here, they generally sound like a good thing to do, like sustain fundamental functions of soil and water. How about number 3, reduce risk from warmer and drier conditions, or 4, reduce the risk and long-term impacts of extreme weather. So you can see some very broad general concepts that form basically the strategies. From there, the strategies are broken down into approaches. And so here's strategy 3 and strategy 4 broken down into individual approaches. And you can see, reducing the risk from warmer and drier conditions could be adjusting the timing or location of on-farm activities, managing crops to cope with warmer and drier conditions, and as well as managing livestock. So again, we're dividing it down into cropping systems, some more basic information, but nothing highly specific at this point in time. And then finally, we have tactics. And this is where I guess you might say the rubber hits the road. These are the specific actions that a producer might take. And there's any number of them. And so within the workbook, they've just listed a variety of examples for each of those. And here again, I've just selected approach 3.2, managing crops for warmer and drier conditions. And you can see that for tactics, it's a variety of things where there might be adjusting the variety of crops, planting, plant populations, might have something to do with irrigation systems, or increasing soil cover, and that sort. So these tactics are the actual actions that a producer might take in order to better understand what's going on. Now, what the whole workbook's trying to do is help connect the dots from broad concepts down to specific actions and implementation. So if, there's some action items or tactics that were recommended through this process, somebody could go back and really understand, well, why did we do that? What was the reason? What's the rationale? And so you can see we started with the goals and objectives of that particular location, moving on to the climate change impacts, and then so on and so forth. So it's really a good way then to connect the dots to help everybody understand why a certain tactic was basically added to the list. Now for the Miller farm, certain things that they were chose to add as in terms of action items or tactics. And you can see here's quite a number of different things. They could plant more acres of fall crops, reduce amount of summer annuals like corn, especially, to have a lesser impact on spring field work. Maybe switching from corn to some other grain, including more drought-tolerant species, obviously some soil health issues, reduced tillage, cover crops and such, and then some pasture management issues as well. So again, these aren't dictated for them, for the producer. As Adam worked through this workbook with the producer, these are just some suggestions. It's like, well, what are all the ideas of things we could do? And then it's really up to the producer to start deciding, well, is this a good idea or not? Is this something that's feasible, especially economically and with the type of equipment he may have? But it just gives them an opportunity to see a whole list of range of things that might be useful to do. And then finally, the fifth step is to monitor. And this is just evaluating the effectiveness of what's done. This takes place over a long period of time, as some of these tactics may have been added to the production system. And here's the ones that were listed for the Miller farm. And as I looked over this table this weekend, it's like, well, it's pretty evident that a large part of this is record keeping. You know, what things do you monitor? What are you looking for? And then basically keeping a good record of what the changes are that are occurring in that particular system based on some of those tactics that might have been implemented. So, you know, one thing we really are trying to see is to get some more adaptation demonstrations created. We've done a number of these, but what I see is this adaptation workbook doesn't do anybody any good just sitting on the shelf, kind of reading it once in a while. We really got to get it out there, get people using it, get some experience with it, and see, you know, how useful it is, and maybe we can tweak it to make it even better. But basically, it is a process then working directly with producers to integrate this climate change information into real-world projects. And by doing so, you can maybe find some more common questions that a producer might have about agriculture itself. You know, so we can maybe create more products and resources to help the farmer and rancher. And we can test this workbook and maybe make it more comprehensive, make it more valuable for others. And what we're looking at is increasing it to you know, beyond the Midwest and the Northeast hub and such. So when we start working with stakeholders or the farmers, you know, we can turn those folks into champions to basically say, hey, yeah, you know, this is a process that really works, and I have a greater understanding of sort of the issues that are at hand. And then by doing so, you know, it really, as it says, meet the farmer where they are, you know, go out and start talking with them about their particular system, and then how, you know, the climate change might directly impact their work. And then incorporate those ideas into their greater farm plan as part of the whole package. Now the question is this workbook regionally specific? And yeah, some of it is. When it was designed originally in the 2016 workbook, the strategies and approaches and tactics were basically targeting the Midwest and the Northeast. But as we've done some additional case studies, we find that the workbook's pretty resilient. You can be applied in other locations around the United States as well, and especially the strategies and approaches fit pretty well. But you know, probably there'll be some additional tactics that will be uncovered and such. So you can see, you know, there are some changes that we're looking at in terms of doing it. And you know, well, I might say that doesn't stop anybody from using the workbook from a location anywhere else in the United States. So the question is, can this resource be manual, be used in other regions? And you bet, it sure can. And that's kind of what we're hoping to see today, is maybe some people will drag that thing off the shelf and work to maybe develop some case studies and test the ideas and work with producers and make it a usable product. So that's what we're hoping to see. I might point out that we have a number of case studies that have been developed by NRCS staff and really others, but I thought I'd toot the horn since I'm NRCS, and these are our staff members that over time have worked on building case studies or worked on the workbook itself. You can see we have a whole list of folks. Right now, Chuck Peacock down towards the bottom is a Climate Hub liaison. working on case studies. He's doing that basically half-time, but we're still trying to keep building case studies and move those forward and keep testing the workbook and getting it out in the hands of folks. So these are locations of some of the case studies we have, mostly in progress. Some of these have been completed as well, but you can see we're testing it, around the United States and such. Just to show you some of the ones that have been completed and the ones that are done are on the Climate Hub website. It's kind of a long link there, but you can see Jody Reisner, who is a conservation agronomist in Texas with the Central National Technical Service Center these days. She did one for the Kettner Farm in Muleshoe, Texas. Joan Howard did one on the Ridgeway Farm in Alaska. We're still trying to get that one finished off. This year, Chuck Peacock did one on a farm in Colorado. And then a couple of those that are available were done by Adam Dowling on both an apple orchard as well as the dairy that we just used as an example. So those are some of the ones that we have completed. There's others as well, and some of the ones that I don't cite are actually in the workbook itself, so they are available there. Now, in terms of picking a project, we don't want to get too big or too small, and so kind of a medium or small size property is kind of the best place to start. If you haven't ever used a workbook, you don't want to get too daunting and overwhelming in terms of building out this information and trying to figure out specific tactics that might be usable. So, you want to focus on, tens to hundreds of acres, a few products or commodities, and then, have something that really makes sense to the producer and that can be usable. Now, in terms of using this adaptation workbook, we have it in a number of forms. We have paper copies. We have a Microsoft Word. There's an Excel spreadsheet that you can fill out. NIAX, or the Northern Forest Climate Hub, has produced the online tool both for forestry and for agriculture. So you can go in there and just do it online, register as a user, and start working down through the workbook as well. So just want to make sure that this product is available in a number of formats. If you go to this adaptationworkbook.org, you can also find the 2016 version of the full complete workbook or Adaptation Resources manual to read through there as well. So for anybody that might be considering an adaptation demonstration, we can really provide you with what you need to get started. And we're willing to assist in using the materials. If you have questions or anything, help, call us by phone or email and check us out, and we'll try. There's a number of folks that can maybe give some advice and help work through the whole process. In preparation for this webinar, we were starting to think that, well, maybe we could do a 2-day adaptive management workshop at some location and date to be determined. And it's kind of based on the amount of interest we might have. Probably thinking based on the location of the North Central Region work group, that it would be somewhere in the Midwest. It could be possibly midwinter or in conjunction with some other meeting. But we really want to focus on maybe a train the trainer, not necessarily have a workshop for producers, but for individuals, whether it be extension agents, universities, other folks, that come in, bring a case study, an example of a farm, and we can work through that process and try to make people comfortable with why things are moving in that direction. What's the process of the workbook, and why is it important to follow these steps and kind of bring out this information. So for anybody that might be interested, you can email me, or I've enlisted the help of Charlene Felke, who's the Climate Hub coordinator in the Midwest, and she's volunteered to list her email there. So, if people are interested, we can sort of see the level of interest and, potentially have a workshop and try to get a number of folks there and work through this and get this workbook out in the hands of people and get it used to a greater degree. So with that, I say thanks. And if anybody has any questions or information, I'd be glad to entertain them.
Okay, well, thanks, Mike. I don't have any questions in there quite yet, but we'll give people a chance to think about it. I'm going to go ahead and pop up this last poll real quick. And while people are thinking about their questions and logging off, they can answer that real quick. While they start typing some things in, I noticed that you had an online version of this. Does that connect people that have filled out the adaptation workbook? I mean, is there any way to see if maybe your neighbor down the road did it, or someone else down the road that maybe you could look at what their challenges were or what they did as far as a tactic to adapt? I don't know if there's any connection between those, because other than the ones that you sort of promote, the larger scale ones.
Yeah, well, you can see that, we're trying to get this out in the hands of folks because we don't have a good record for all the ones that have been done. And I'm not sure how actively this workbook has been used. So the ones that I'm aware of, the demonstration or case studies, are the ones that have been done by the liaisons, other NRCS employees, and others connected with the Climate Hub. So, boy, that'd be a great idea at some point if we get enough of them. But we're not up to the 250 like they are in the forest adaptation workbook.
Sure.
So we're still at the beginning stages, and and that's one good reason to sort of bring this up today. Is like, yeah, let's see if we can get it useful. This really wasn't put together just to set on a bookshelf and reference once in a while. It's a user's manual, and we need to have some people that are interested in and hopefully find it useful. And I think based on the success that they've had on the forest end of things, this could really be a great tool. And I might point out also that the folks that have built these case studies within NRCS that I have regular communication with, I think once they get through with one, they start to, some ideas start, coming to their minds like, yeah, this really is a great processing, and it is usable and is a great way to approach, helping the producer better understand the impacts of climate change.
Sure. Okay. There's been a number of questions kind of pop in here as we get going. First one, is the online tool a decision support tool as well as sort of a guideline?
Well, in the end, if you go through the workbook, even online, you will come up with some specific tactics, basically by, deciding on, the strategies and approaches, and then looking at the tactics, and then, maybe create them some new ones that are more applicable. So you can say it's somewhat of a decision support tool, but we are not trying to do anything more than suggest certain tactics to a producer. This isn't dictatorial or one of those things where, okay, this is what we recommend. These are some great ideas. And then there's a lot of other issues, especially in agriculture, that, it's not just, well, we're just not fighting climate change and that's all we care about. It's the profitability, it's the type of equipment they have, and, all the other issues that go along with farming and ranching. And as we know that, there's a lot of economic pressures on farms these days. And so we just got to make sure that, we're not telling people or telling producers, this will be the answer to all your needs, because we don't really have that idea, but we can maybe suggest some things that they can think about, and think about which ones are, best ones to, push forward in the short run, or maybe think about in the future as things get a little better, either economically or as they see climate change that's getting worse in their area, maybe it becomes more of a need, but then those tactics are available for them to refer back to.
Sure. Okay. A couple questions on planned studies, sort of kind of moving forward. And one question says, are there any planned case studies in Pennsylvania? As well as another question of, maybe what are the next steps to setting up case study sites in the Midwest or other areas?
Well, this is where we're really kind of reaching out to, people to, I know there was a case study and it is in our workbook from Pennsylvania. Right now, I don't know of any others, that are ongoing right now in that particular state. We really need somebody that, wants to work with a producer to build a case study. The interesting thing about the climate hubs is it's a very small cadre of individuals. And, you know, a lot of the climate hubs only have a couple people that to, you know, occupy all the responsibilities of keeping the hub going. And so that's why we really depend on partnerships with all sorts of people. And, you know, so anybody that has an interest in this, we more than welcome, we'll work with you and try to, you know, help create case studies. But by and large, you know, you need to have a farmer that is willing to spend a little time. I think that's one of the things that we found. You know, a producer might say, yeah, I'm willing, you can come out sometime, but then actually getting part of their time to sit down and work through these, you know, sometimes that's difficult. So this is where we're confronted with.
Okay. A couple people had asked questions regarding maybe where to get the hard copy workbooks, or if someone can order them, or does someone mail them out to people, or how maybe they might get a hold of this?
You know, we had twice we've printed some copies. I don't know how many are available now, but if people want to send me an email and request a hard copy, you know, I can maybe get some put together. I might even, you know, get some more printed if we need to. And then typically, you know, we take them to meetings and then they all get, you know, used and taken away. And so we don't keep a stash of them on hand, but I could sure get some printed if we need.
Okay, and it's available online, correct? Just not
right. They can download the PDF and print it out themselves. Sure.
Okay. No questions. A little different, but you know, what type of record-keeping tools or software or apps do farmers already use that could work for tracking the implementation of these adaptation actions or tactics?
Well, I would, you know, that's something obviously I'm not real familiar with because I don't work directly, you know, with farm record keeping and such. So I probably can, you know, give you my thoughts on it. But other than that, I think, you know, if a farmer's going through and collecting records, you know, you just need to see which ones are applicable. And you know, and I would think most producers these days have a pretty good system for, you know, keeping records and collecting information. And so it's a matter of seeing which ones are applicable to the exact tactics that they might implement over time.
Sure. I know some of the new things that they use, they can, the capability is there to track everything. It's just a matter of technology and time and analyzing the data. So yeah, there's certainly programs there that could do that.
Sure.
Would this, a question is, would this be applicable or useful to integrate with regional modeling efforts?
Well, I guess the question is, what sort of models are we talking about, you know, in terms of climate change models and such, that they could get down to more site-specific recommendations of impacts of climate change? I guess in that case it is. You know, if somebody had some ideas in terms of other aspects of modeling and how information out of this might be irrelevant, you know, I think if we had enough case studies, it might potentially be. So it's the work in building case studies and getting that information produced.
Okay, question on if there's a case study on hemp production.
No, but you know, that would be a good one. You know, I don't know how many producers right now. I think they've talked about it in Nebraska. I know there was some questions a year or two ago in Oklahoma. So I think more and more producers are getting into that, you know, crop. And yeah, that'd be very interesting. I'd like to see that. You know, that'd be great.
Okay, and someone asked about if there have been events with groups of producers to inform them on how to use the workbook, or if you've done a lot with maybe, you know, how they could meet with NRCS or other providers to help use the workbook. I know you mentioned a little bit about you'd like to schedule one, at least with maybe the providers or people that might help with this, but have you done many other things that might go directly with producers or planned in the future to do that?
We don't have, we've done, yeah, I know I can remember a training session that's been about 3 years ago. We did one, it was up in Wisconsin, where we brought in a number of folks and worked through the workbook. And this was at the time when they, you know, we're putting it together. And so, you know, since the workbook has been produced, we've just been trying to have some Climate Hub detailees or liaisons, as well as some of the Climate Hubs build some of these case studies or demonstration projects. And I have to say that it's probably going slower than I would like to see it. Maybe I'm more impatient than I should be, but time goes on, and it should be great to get it out in the hands of more people and make it useful. But if somebody was uncertain on how to do one, to some degree, it's, well, dive in and test the workbook out online and see how it works, and have questions. And then if we can get enough people interested, we'd welcome another workshop at some point.
Sure. Okay. Is there applicability for wildlife refuges?
I know that, and I can't speak for certain, that NIACS, not only do they have one for forested areas, but they have one for urban, the same sort of, adaptive management process. And I think they have part of what they've created is one for wildlife areas. I know we have a Climate Hub liaison, Stacy Clark from Minnesota. She's working with the Northern Forest Hub, or NIACS, this year, and she's doing some work with the workbook on forested areas as well as wetlands. So I know there's some pretty good application. And they are hosting a workshop in Pennsylvania, I think in late September, looking at using the Forest Adaptation Resources guide there, and Stacy's taking part in that as well. So there will be a workshop on forestry in I think late September. I don't have the date exactly. So, but I know Stacy has been interested in wetlands as part of it, and I would think wildlife could easily be branched out by developing the workbook with a few additional tools.
Do you have a contact for Stacy that you just mentioned?
I think it's stacy.clark@usda.gov.
Okay. I want to have a question. Oh, explanation on the modeling efforts. They're talking about watershed modeling that aims to generate scenarios based on partial adoption of climate smart practices. So I don't know if that ties in with this.
I think it could. I think, the workbook doesn't get down to actually measuring the impact of any one tactic, basically recommended practices. And I think to do modeling on something like that, you would have to basically understand the impact of one particular, say, conservation practice on decreasing erosion or increasing water infiltration, and then modeling it in that direction. That would be my understanding. And so this particular workbook doesn't go that direction, and it's not that comprehensive.
Okay. Someone had asked if you'll make the PowerPoints available following this.
I can. I don't know how you want me to do it, so I can send them to you, Tyler?
Well, yeah, just go ahead and send them to me. And what we do is we archive this webinar, and we'll put it on the northcentralclimate.org website, and we'll just have a spot on there to click on, like the PDF version of slides or whatever makes sense. So
okay,
we can get that up there following this, and it usually takes a couple days to get it up and going.
That sounds great.
Trying to see if I missed any other questions. I don't think so. Couple comments on, what is missing is a runoff model of current land use tied to future rainfall, i.e. more intensity and more erosion, flooding. Probably more of a comment, I guess, than a question for you, but certainly we could always use more models for projections, that's for sure.
Well, sure, yeah, no doubt.
So I don't think I see any more questions popping up. As soon as I say that, someone probably will, but we'll certainly make this available. It'll be on the northcentralclimate.org website. So you can go there and check the archive. We'll have another webinar in October, and hopefully everyone can kind of jump back on. So thanks again, Mike. Appreciate you jumping on and giving us a webinar. You can see if anyone has any last questions, there's Mike's contact information there, or you can reach out to me and I can connect you as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and sign off, and thanks again, Mike, and have a good day, everyone.
All right, thank you.